Okay, so this video we're going to talk about consciousness. Main things I want you to get, we're going to talk about the hard problem versus the easy problem of consciousness. We're going to talk about philosophical zombies, and we are going to talk about Thomas Nagel's What It's Like to Be a Bat, and Jackson's A Mary Problem. So those are the ones you want to make sure you understand from this one. Last class we talked about, it seems like at least one of the things that AI doesn't have yet is consciousness, right? Like that was one of the things people appeal to very much is one thing at least distinguishing us from the bots so far, at least for the time being, is that we seem to have conscious mental states, and that's not anything that's going on in AI yet, right? So if we're going to say things like that, then we want to go, well, what are we talking about? What is this consciousness thing that we are claiming we have that these things don't yet have? When we go back to the mind body problem, right? Arguably, consciousness is why that problem has been so intractable, right? Um, it looks like we could give a very nice functionalist account of what's going on when we talk about mental states and the mind in general, except for there's this extra layer, there's this extra thing that just doesn't seem to be accounted for or exhausted by giving a functionalist model, right? There's something left out of those pictures. And consciousness seems to be what that is, right? So it's pointing to the sort of this last great mystery when it comes to our mind, this thing that we have yet to sort of get a real good grasp on. And you look at the brain sciences, people still don't have like a solid account of what exactly consciousness is, right? There's a number of competing theories, but nobody knows that. Anybody that's saying, oh, we figured it out, here's like what the neuroscientific account of consciousness is, they're simplifying, or they're reducing, or they're ignoring things that we don't have a good account of what consciousness is yet. And there is no consensus. There's pretty strong consensus about what consciousness is not, right? Brain scientists came out a couple years back, right, and they overwhelmingly rejected the picture that was very popular in Silicon Valley with a bunch of tech bros, right? This idea of consciousness is the integration of information, right? And the brain science community came out and said, look, that's pseudoscience. That's probably a little too strong, right? But what they should really be saying is just like, this is one of many competing theories, and there's no real clear idea what exactly we're talking about yet when we're talking about consciousness. The field's wide open. Thomas Nagel gets the ball rolling from a philosophical standpoint here, right? Because if we're going to talk about consciousness, we have to figure out, well, what are we talking about, right? We know, okay, so there's some sort of distinction between things that don't have minds and things that do have minds. Things with minds have conscious mental states. That's nice. What are you talking about? Nagel tries to give an account of, or at least gesture at, what this so-called consciousness thing is in his really influential paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? Right. And what Nagel does is he just gets us to think about this thought experiment. He's like, look, humans can never know what it's like to be a bat, right? And that's because there's something uniquely bat-like about bat experience, right? Like if I think about what it's like to be a bat, I can talk about how they process information, how their minds work, what their physiology is like, what their lives are like. We can study all that. At best, what we can sort of identify is, okay, well, bats, see by sonar, right? So their visual experiences are going to be radically different than our own. And then they have a mind, like a brain, and, information processing that's going to be, I guess, much more simplistic than than the experience of a human, right? So we're thinking of something that experiences the world in terms of sonar and through a bat brain, right? So we could try to project, and we could try to imagine, well, what is that like? What would it be like to see without sort of, sight, right? Without, with your sight coming from sonar. We can guess at what that would be like, but that's all we're doing at best, is we're imagining what it would be like for us to be bats. But that's not what it's like for a bat to be a bat, right? There's no way for us to sort of project and imagine even what the conscious experience of batness is really like, right? It's inaccessible to us. And there's no amount of physical facts about the world or theorizing that will give us access to that. I think another good example, I don't think like a man can ever really understand what it's like to be pregnant, right? We can guess, but like fundamentally alien experience to what's physiologically available to a cisgender male, right? There's these kinds of experiences that are just inaccessible to us, right? Or these, and it's because the conscious experience of that person or that animal is in some way alien to us, right? And that's what we're trying to get at is what's that phenomenological feel? What is it like to be? What is it like to experience? And what exactly is that and why is that, right? Now, in some sense, what Nagel's pointing to here is that there's a certain kind of subjectivity of experience, right? Um, and that's really what we're after when we're after consciousness, right? And we can call this the phenomenological consciousness, right? The painfulness of pain, the redness of red, the private and ineffable property of being, right? That's phenomenological consciousness, and that's really what we're after when we're after consciousness, right? When we talk about consciousness, consciousness is one of those terms that we use and operationalize and define in all sorts of ways that aren't really the same things, right? Like we can talk about consciousness as awareness, right? Being aware that you have mental states, right? Or being aware that you're in a state at all, right? Some people define consciousness that way. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about phenomenological consciousness, right? You can have a system, a really simple system that is monitoring itself, that knows what's going on with it, that can check its states, right? Like you can have a thermometer that does that. That's awareness, but not phenomenological consciousness. Um, Even being aware that you are, right? That's a kind of consciousness, having self consciousness. I'm aware that I exist, right? Um, Again, that's a type of consciousness, but it's not this thing. What we're looking for here is what philosophers have came to call qualia, the property of not merely being a red flower, but the redness of red flowers, right? Or the painfulness of painful states, right? It's this the something it is like to have that state. This is something that seems like it goes beyond mere function, right? There's no there's nothing that the redness of red things is doing for us, right? It's not like it changes our behaviors, right? It's just this extra thing above and beyond the fact that there's this functional state of redness, and then there's this extra thing, and on top of that, it also feels like something for me to experience red. That's what we're trying to get at when we get at consciousness. And it's really difficult to sort of even give like an account of what it is we're talking about there, or to sort of get at how you might even study that. And that's arguably one of the reasons this problem's been so intractable. For a long time, it was even reasonable to just sort of think that there's sort of like some sort of philosophical sleight of hand here, that it's hard to see exactly what people are talking about when they talk about qualia as a thing. So a lot of philosophical thought experiments in this idea are just sort of designed to get people to kind of to motivate the idea that there might be this phenomenological thing that goes over and above the functional state that we're trying to account for. So the inverted spectrum problem is an example of this, right? And this used to be really hard to motivate. I think it's become really easy to motivate recently for we've had some really nice examples that just make this really vivid. But the inverted spectrum problem, trying to get at this idea that qualia is this thing that's not functional, like phenomenological consciousness is sort of over and above the functional mental state. And it's this thing that we have to account for. So somebody says, imagine like imagine somebody with an inverted qualia spectrum, right? With red and green, right? So they've had this their whole life. So anytime they've been exposed to red things, they, their functional states are exactly the same as the rest of us, except for they have the qualia, they have the phenomenological experience of greenness. Every time we would have the phenomenological experience of redness. So systemically, right, that green phenomenological state has been applied to their functional states of red, essentially, right? And then they've just gone through their whole life there. And the thought is, can you imagine somebody with an inverted spectra, right? Could you imagine somebody where they have this systemic inversion of qualitative phenomenological states? Um, there would be no change in function, right? They would behave exactly like the rest of us. It's just their phenomenology would be different. And then the thought is, given that that's possible, qualia is not merely a functional state. Qualia is over and above, and that's what we're trying to, identify, right? Better example or real life example, right? A couple years ago, this dress was a long time ago. This dress was all over the internet, right? And people were debating about what they were looking at. Is this white and gold, or is this blue and black, right? And people were radically divided on what they were looking at. And here seems like a really nice, sort of really vivid picture where people have different qualitative experiences of the same thing. And if we didn't have that image floating around, we wouldn't even really know, right, that we were looking at something and experiencing it radically differently. But it does seem to be the case here, right, that people go one way or the other, right? People interpret the image in different ways, and that leads them to think they're looking at something slightly different. This isn't a perfect example of inverted spectra, right? Because here there is a functional difference, right? Some of us think we're interpreting an image of a black and blue dress that is, lit up in a certain way, right? And so the light's sort of flashing, and so it's looking lighter than it is, but that's what we're looking at. Others think that we're looking at something that's backlit, right? And so you're looking at a white and gold dress, and so it's appearing differently. So there is functional differences here in the mental states that people are sort of going to. But what this is maybe gesturing at is just like we can have qualitatively different phenomenological experiences of the exact same thing, right? And that's what somebody is getting at when they talk about qualia, right? Is what it's like to experience reality could be fundamentally different for a lot of us, probably is, without it making any obvious or drastic or even any change to how our mental states function, right? The qualia seems to be this extra thing, this thing that's over and above the merely functional mental. Another example, the shoes, the shoe on the left is either green and black or pink and white, depending on how you interpret the image you're looking at, right? Now, regardless of whether or not there's a functional account of these differences, and like people have, right? People have been talking for years at this point about why that phenomenon occurred, right? But regardless of whether there's a functional difference there, there's still the clear possibility of different subjective experiences generated by the same functional perception, right? And that gestures to this idea that there might be this qualia thing, right? There might be this phenomenological conscious states that we need to account for in a complete account of consciousness, right? And that's what we're trying to do, is give an account of phenomenological consciousness. And so the problem still persists. What is consciousness? Okay, two other arguments here that sort of gesture towards this, right? And then for this course, that's more than enough. We're going to look at Mary, the Mary problems. This is a case from Frank Jackson. He's, strictly speaking, arguing against physicalism, but we're going to just look at this again as a way of trying to motivate phenomenological consciousness as a thing, and then we're going to look at David Chalmers' zombie experiments. So in the Mary case, Mary's a color expert, right? So she knows everything there is to know about color, and she even wrote her dissertation on, she writes her PhD on red, right? But she's spent her entire life in this color deprivation center where the only colors she's ever experienced are black and white, and then I guess shades of gray, right? So she's never seen, blue or purple or green or red. Like she's never seen any color, right? That's probably why she's been fascinated by color. So she spends her whole career, in childhood, studying color and studying, accounts of redness, and she learns every single physical fact about the color red. She knows every possible piece of knowledge there is to know about red. She's never had a red experience because she's never been able to see anything red, right? So she writes her dissertation on the nature of red, and then she, as I guess, as a prize for writing the dissertation, right? They go, okay, you can leave the room now. So she walks out of the room, and then sitting on a a white pillow in the room that she walks into is a red strawberry. And then the question is does Mary learn anything new when she leaves the room? Now you might think, well, she can't on some account, right? Like if she knew every physical fact about the color red, right, then there's nothing new for her to learn, right? She knew it all already, so she should go, oh, there's a red strawberry. That's exactly what I thought it would look like. But intuitively, right, it seems like there's something new she does learn when she leaves the room, right? She learns what it's like to experience redness, right, for the first time. But if that's true, then there's a fact that goes beyond the mere functional or the mere physical, right? There's this extra kind of fact. And that's what Jackson wants to get at, right? And again, he's trying to show that physicalism is incomplete. But we can think about this in terms of just the problem of phenomenological consciousness, right? Is it seems like there's something that she's getting out of the experience of redness, the redness of red, right? The qualia of red that goes above and beyond the mere physical account of red. And to the extent that we think that that's plausible, then that again points us towards, look, there's this type of thing, phenomenological consciousness, that is not merely functional, that we need to account for. And that's something that, as far as we know, is unique to human experience, right? But that's what we're looking for, is what is that? What is that thing that she gets when she leaves the room? Right? What Mary learns, if anything, is what it's like for her to see red, the quality of red sensation. That seems to be like a non-physical fact, right? Now, it's really hard to deny qualia, right? For many people, there's nothing more intuitive and more direct than our knowledge of our own experiences, the knowledge of our own phenomenological, subjective, um, just experience of being, right? But it's incredibly difficult to figure out what it is we're talking about when we talk about qualia, right? Like it does seem sort of like hand wavy. Um, are there are these physical properties of our brain or our body or of the world? And so what kind of physical properties are they? Are these non-physical properties? And then how would a non-physical property work? What does that even mean? Are they emergent properties? What kind? Are they an epiphenomenon? An epiphenomenon is a thing that it would exist but doesn't have any sort of causal potency, right? These are non-physical properties that don't really do anything causal. Some people want consciousness to be, I guess, kind of like the steam, right? Like the byproduct of the of existing, and you might want to do that because you might want to have a causally closed physical system in which sort of everything that happens is accounted for by physical causation, and then but if we're adding in non-physical qualia as a kind of property, then suddenly you have this thing that's not physical that is also causing things, and that seems problematic. So some people go, oh, well, what these are is they're an epiphenomenon. They're caused by the causal processes that account for everything we do, but they themselves, being non-physical, cannot cause anything, right? Maybe there's just a conceptual confusion here, right? Maybe there's some sort of philosophical hand waving that's going on that sort of leads us to think, oh, qualia is this thing. Yeah, I get it. Redness of red, on board with you. But really, there's nothing actually there to account for. Every single one of those accounts is problematic. Again, a lot of people sort of follow this intuition, sort of grasp or can gesture at, I get this is what we're trying to give an account of, or this is what we're talking about. But there isn't really any good theories. Definitely no decisive theory of what consciousness is, or even what we're talking about here, or what a science of consciousness might look like. Last thing we'll talk about related to this topic then is from David Chalmers. David Chalmers is trying to, again, gesture at what exactly is the problem here. And he brings up what he calls the easy problem versus the hard problem of consciousness. And he uses something called the philosophical zombie to motivate this problem, right? Philosophical zombie is just like you and me, except for there's nothing it's like to be a philosophical zombie. So don't eat brains. They just have no qualia, right? So they look at a red rose. They have the functional mental states associated with looking at a red rose, right? They perceive it. They go, oh, that's a red rose. And right? So they do all that, but there's nothing it's like for them to see the red rose. Think about an AI, right? I guess like a really sophisticated AI might, engage in a lot of the kind of um, the behaviors, right? The structure of experience or something like that. But Chalmers would say, well, what they're missing um, is this phenomenological thing, right? I shouldn't say Chalmers would say that, but somebody might say that they basically are at best philosophical zombies, right? They have the functional states associated with conscious behaviors, but there's nothing it's like to be an AI as of yet. So and that's what they're lacking. That's what you're trying to account for is what is that thing? What's that extra thing that has to be there for redness, not merely to be something that you perceive and I identify that, I classify it properly, I interact with it properly. And there's something it's like for me to see red, right? That's the idea here. Now, Chalmers distinguishes between what we call easy and hard problems of consciousness. Easy problems, he thinks these are the things that brain sciences have been working on for a long time. These are the things that we can use traditional functionalist methods, essentially, and existing physical theories to account for. So access consciousness, I talked about that earlier. How is it that we can, discriminate sensory stimuli and react to them appropriately? How can I identify, oh, that's a red rose, that's a blue, that's a yellow tulip. And then how can I react appropriately? Monitoring or self-consciousness, this is what your thermometer would do, right? How am I aware that I'm having mental states? Like if I have a belief right now that I'm in a room talking to a camera, right? I'm monitoring my mental states and I'm aware of them and I'm responding to them. Not any reason why any of that has to feel like something, not any reason why any of that has to have a phenomenological feel. That's monitoring consciousness. Self-consciousness is being aware that I am, right? These types of states are the typical types of things we would talk about in the brain sciences. These are easy problems for Chalmers, not because they're easy to solve, but because we know how to address them, right? We have methods that reliably work to account for and make sense of these things. The hard problem is hard, again, not because it's actually hard, we just don't know how difficult it would be to solve this problem, but it's hard because we haven't solved it, right? It's hard because we don't really know how to think about this yet. How is it that a physical brain or physiological process in general gives rise to subjective experience, right? How is it that qualia is here? Where does it come from? Why does it come from? What purpose does it serve, right? Especially given that it seems like you can account for everything that we do without qualia. So why and how, right? There seems to be an explanatory gap there, right? For Chalmers, physical theories are suited to explain why systems have a certain physical structure and how they perform those functions. But consciousness seems quite different, right? Explaining the function of a system and how it's structured won't tell us why a conscious experience accompanies the functioning, right? It seems like the functioning could occur without there being this extra thing. And so we have the problem. So that again leads us to the hard problem. Why is the performance of those functions accompanied by conscious experience at all? It doesn't seem like it's doing anything or needed to do anything. And we could just dismiss it, except for we all know there is something it's like to see a red rose, right? There is something it's like to stub your finger. And that's the problem of phenomenological consciousness. Okay, thanks.